Welcome to Ideas. I'm Paul Kennedy, and this is part 4 of David Cayley's series on the corruption of Christianity with Ivan Illich.
The idea of fit, of appropriateness, of a thing which is good, just simply good, no matter what value it has. This idea has been washed out in post-1950 ordinary thinking.
Cultures, Ivan Illich says, were once defined by their sense of how things fit together. The experienced world was a cosmos, a Greek word for what the French call vis-a-vis, the way things line up in relation to each other. Heaven and earth, sea and shore, woman and man, each giving presence and definition to the other. Cosmos was the order of relationships in which things had been placed, and people's actions were tailored to this order. What was good was what fit. This sense of fit, Illich claims, has now vanished from contemporary culture. We no longer live in a cosmos, a proportioned world in which each thing defines and complements its opposite. How this world was lost and how this loss can be understood as a perversion of Christianity are Illich's themes in part 4 of David Cayley's series, The Corruption of Christianity.
During the first 3 broadcasts in this series, Ivan Illich has argued the hypothesis that much of what is unique and unprecedented in modern Western society can best be understood as a corruption of Christianity, a hypothesis he sums up in the formula, the corruption of the best is the worst. Many 20th century social theorists have written about the formative influence of Christian thinking on contemporary institutions, but they have generally seen these institutions as a practical realization of Christian spiritual ideals. Illich, as his carefully chosen word corruption suggests, takes a radically different view. He understands the modern world to be involved in a betrayal of its Christian antecedents. He calls the modern attempt to remake the world a blasphemy, another carefully chosen word which means a sin against faith. Through faith, he has written, what I see and feel, I know to be creation. What I see as real, I know exists only by participation in the divine goodness. But the world in which I find myself, he goes on, is mostly an artificial world, a manufactured construct ever further removed from creation, a world in the hands of experts who presume, through a kind of transcendent pride, to manage it. Illich approaches this reality as an historian who believes that only through careful study of the past can we cultivate a sense of how strangely out of tune our contemporary society is. Only in the mirror of the past, he says, does it become possible to recognize the radical otherness of modern assumptions. He begins his reflections tonight by looking back to the genesis of one of those assumptions, the idea that the world lies in human hands, open to unlimited manipulation. He finds its origin in an idea that deeply colored the Christian sensibility of the Middle Ages, the idea of contingency. This conception, he says, expressed both the fullest flowering of the Christian sense of the cosmos and the seeds of the eventual shattering of this cosmos. He opens with a definition, occasionally quoting from an article on the Christian concept of contingency by German historian of philosophy Hans Blumenberg, which Illich sometimes consulted as he spoke.
Contingency refers to a state of living in a world which doesn't bear in itself the reasons for its own existence, but gets it from an absolutely necessary, personal, ever-creating God. That things get their existence, their presence in the world, for an act of the will of the Creator. We are both in our essence human beings, but it is a personal act of God's will to bring you and also that little cat, that kitten there, into existence and keep it in existence. And in front of this act of God's goodness, I can do nothing else but bow in deep respect.
The idea that the world's existence is contingent on the will of God has deep biblical roots and is shared by other monotheistic religions like Judaism and Islam, but it receives a unique accent during the Christian Middle Ages, and above all in the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. Central to this Christian version of the idea, and central also to Illich's own philosophy, is the notion of existence as a personal gift.
At this moment, the world's very existence assumes the nature of something gratuitous. The world which is around me, the cat over there, and the roses, the 4 red roses which bloomed during the night, are a gift, something which is a grace. This moment of our being together, which I immensely enjoy, is not predetermined by some karma, isn't a chance, isn't logical necessary, is a pure gift. It's a gift from that Creator who keeps beings in existence. And therefore we can also understand our own activity of freely sitting here together as a gift to each other in an entirely new way.
The novelty and originality of this idea, Illich says, continuing to quote Blumenberg, can be seen by comparing it to classical views of how the world is brought into existence.
The coming into existence of the antique cosmos, the cosmos of Aristotle, the cosmos of Plato, was in no way dependent on the act of someone's will, neither in its genesis, its coming about, in its birth, nor in its continuation. The cosmos was but the fullness of expression of what was identically fit for existence. If something came into existence, came into being, it came into existence. You couldn't think of the contingent. However, since Augustine, things have changed. Augustine answered the question why God created the world with that incredible quia vult, because it pleased him, because he willed it, he wanted it. In Spanish I would say, porque tenía ganas. I know that in America you don't have ganas. It's something which is a will which comes from pretty deep in the stomach of God. The world's existence is the result, therefore, at every moment and in the way it is, of a sovereign act.
The idea that the world at every moment depends on God's will is, for Illich, a glorious expression of the surprising, unfathomable generosity of existence. But contingency, he says, is also a fragile and unstable doctrine, because it hangs existence by a single thread. Only break the thread, and the world tumbles from the hands of God into the hands of man. God's sovereignty becomes the model for human dominion. Such a break was made thinkable, Illich says, by a change in the way later medieval thinkers, like Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, interpreted this doctrine. To put it as simply as possible, these philosophers, basing themselves in part on Augustine's quia voluit, put more and more emphasis on God's freedom, until his will came to be seen as something arbitrary. Thomas Aquinas had seen creation as something possessing a rational and intelligible structure. Duns Scotus, writing just a generation later, claimed that there can be no rational explanation for God's will whatsoever. His will is unintelligible as anything other than pure will. This teaching made God's very being contingent, and contingency, in consequence, began to take on the meaning that any dictionary will tell you it has today: mere chance, instance, or accident. The stage was set, Illich says, for the philosophers of the 17th century to claim that each being has within its own nature the reasons for its existence.
His will became the symbol for arbitrarity and prepared the way for an understanding of the world outside of contingency, dependent on, as a contingent, is a chance world, a world of chance, in which everything bears in itself the reason for its being. For a long time, in the 17th, 18th, even early 18th century, these were still true Christian believers who confirmed constantly that God created the world as it is, and therefore placed the seed of nature into each thing, but the connection between the aliveness of nature and the constant creative act of God was cut, was broken.
One of the consequences of this cut in the taut thread of contingency, Illich says, was that nature lost what had never before been in doubt, its aliveness.
One thing was certain in antiquity, that nature was alive. That natura a nascitura dicitur, that nature is a concept, an idea, an experience derived from birth-giving. That therefore, things as we are, if we say we are natural, we say we are born. And this idea is deeply affected in the 12th century by the sense of contingency. The whole of nature lies in God's hands. Nature has its aliveness through its constant support by the creative act of God. But with this elevation, for me, glorification of classical nature, the condition was created by which, once nature was taken out of the hands of God, it could also lose its most essential quality, which is aliveness. If therefore we speak about the 17th and 18th century, the rise of natural science, we are faced by the research on a nature which not only is outside of the hands of God, but has lost that basic characteristic which it had all through antiquity in our tradition, of aliveness. And once you have to do with a science which studies the working of nature separated from aliveness, you can call it mechanical, you can call it necessary, if any name to it you want, an issue comes up which is characteristically modern. How do you explain, how do you speak about life in a nature and among natural things which are not born, but so to say, mathematically programmed, we would say today, by what remains of nature?
With this denaturing of nature, Illich argues, the cosmos came apart at its seams. The microcosm ceased to mirror the macrocosm, because things now contained within themselves the seeds of their nature, or, as one would say today, the principles of their development. The being of things in the world was no longer determined by their mutual correspondence or fit, but by an internal law peculiar to that thing. Through the unique, overbearing power of the idea of contingency, the pattern of the world was broken. This shattering of the sense of proportion, Illich claims, produced a new world, a world unlike any that had ever been before. This novel, unprecedented character becomes clear, he says, when it is contrasted with the informing idea of all previous societies.
The idea that heaven is mirrored by earth, and the earth is mirrored by heaven. That this baby I saw yesterday in a woman's arms is a cosmos, a microcosmos, and that I can look at the stars or look at this baby's makeup and look in two directions where I see something which at first sight is utterly dissymmetric and yet fitting in every point. I need a specially trained gaze to do that, which anthropologists call cultures. I rather speak of the art of seeing the cosmos, bearing it, suffering it, and enjoying it. The certainty that there is a correspondence between the beyond and the here, beyond which might be the stars. Seems to be, at least for those worlds of which I know something, certain. It's the background, the magma out of which at least circum-Mediterranean cultures, but as far as I can understand also Far Eastern cultures, in the Mexican, Aztec and Maya cosmos, which I know a little bit, presuppose, you can't enter there without having that assumption that the world is the result of a mutually constitutive complementarity between here and there.
The idea of contingency, of a world dependent on a single supreme will, threatened to unbalance this proportioned cosmos. This potentially corrosive effect was quite evident, for example, to the wise men of China, when the first Christian missionary reached the Chinese court at the end of the 16th century.
Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits, sent one of his best men, Padre Ricci, to Macau, the only foothold available Portuguese colony already, one town, it still is. And Ricci, who had trained his memory in northern Italy, in the Po Valley, splendidly with the elaboration of his time of the Ciceronian rules of memory training, succeeded to learn something like 25,000 Chinese signs in a few years. And once he knew these, which had never happened before, with somebody coming from the outside would know these signs, that is, would know Chinese, he somehow picked it up, and therefore had to be admitted to the imperial court in Peking as a bonze, Matteo Ricci. Now, barely was he speaking, teaching there, letters from all over China of the lettered men streamed in to imperial court, calling to attention the fact that this was a most dangerous and poisonous man. He didn't speak about God. He knew that he shouldn't. Neither the pre-Socratic nor the post-Socratic divinities of classical times existed there, nor the Wotans of Northern Europe. God seems not to be, or gods, a very Chinese idea. But Ricci was talking about a master in heaven. And they all called to the attention of the emperor that if we admit a master in heaven, the perfect balance between heaven and China, heaven and earth, would be broken. China would cease to be this world, the center of this world, the reason for this world, as the heaven is the reason for China. These Chinese learned literati understood that the spirit of contingency, at a time of its very advanced sunset, was still poisonous and upsetting for China for a metaphysical reason, because China was based on an equal balance, a perfect balance, because up and down, above and below.
To upset this balance, as the Chinese literati quickly grasped, was to undo the harmonious proportions of the traditional cosmos. Things would lose their natural tuning and no longer fit together. And this was precisely what began to happen, Illich says, in 17th century Europe. A world that had formerly taken its very existence from something beyond itself now came to exist entirely in itself, of itself, and for itself.
We can think about a world of objects and of persons and of social constellations here to which nothing on the other side corresponds. It is not only a wombless world, it is a world in which the idea of frontier, of limit, has a meaning which I think before Newton and Leibniz was inconceivable, because if we spoke of limit, horizon, by using the word itself, it was a frontier to something else. The ability of living in a world in which, therefore, frontier has no beyond, is something profoundly new, which I would like to explore, how it affects our daily dealings, which make us so different from all other cultures, worlds, languages, makes even our writing of poetry arbitrary in a way which was not available to the Renaissance, even if some modern text theoreticians try to colonize the Renaissance past with our contemporary ideas of analogy.
A world with no beyond, Illich argues, is also deprived of its sense of a uniquely proportioned here, that distinctive way in which a given people in a given place embody their sense of what is good. When it becomes possible to conceive of a frontier with no beyond, he says, the feeling that things can be good in themselves breaks down. The old language of good gives way to a new language of values. And this, for Illich, represents the decisive moment in the detuning and disproportioning of the world. The good is something for which people have a culturally shaped sense, as real as smell or touch, a sense for what, in a given context, fits. Values lack this distinct color, shape, and feel. They are, by definition, relative and interchangeable. Like commodities, they circulate and change shape, respecting no boundary. They can be arranged in hierarchies, then shifted and reprioritized. They know no stability, permanence, or place. And for this reason, Illich says, this new language can no longer incarnate what people once sensed as the good.
I must first make it clear that as far as I can understand, I live in a world which has lost the sense for good, the good. The certainty that the world makes sense because things fit together. That the eye is made to grasp the sun, not the sunlight to have an optical effect on that biological camera, which still works somehow in my head. The sense that virtuous behavior is fitting, appropriate for the human being. And we have lost it in the course of the 17th and 18th and 19th century with the rise of the concept and the experience of value. Good is absolute, in the sense either it's the light and the eye are made for each other, and this is deeply experienced, or the eye has value for me because it allows me to orient myself in the world. The moment I speak about, in philosophy, about values, which can of course be positive and also negative, I already assume that there is somewhere a 0 point from where values rise or decline. It is not the economy which introduces commodity-like reflections into philosophy, but it's the philosophical replacement of the good by value, by the idea of value, which finds also an expression in economics, which then is one of the major forces shaping the milieu within which my life is a pursuit of values and not anymore the pursuit of the good for me, which can be only another person. What else could it be?
The language of values, according to Illich, makes it impossible any longer to speak of either good or evil, because both are absolute concepts which cannot be connected to any purely relative scale. And this has profound consequences for Christianity, he says, because it hides the existence of sin.
In the tradition of which I speak, sin allows a heightened understanding of evil. Evil is the opposite to good. It's not a disvalue or a negative value. And sin is a mysterious aspect of evil, which I see connected with a personal offense of God. If I'm not wrong, the loss of this philosophy, the certainty about good and evil, and its replacement by value and disvalue, has destroyed the basis on which the existence of sin was predicated, because sin cannot be connected to negative values.
What follows for Illich is that we have lost the only language in which the modern condition can be adequately grasped, because to him sin is the only name that can comprehend the betrayal of Christ's New Testament that this condition represents. And this, to him, is the worst, for not only have we lost the sense for what fits, we have also lost any way of recognizing that it has gone. The feeling for just proportions, for what fit, Ivan Illich has argued, was a physical sense, a real perceptual ability that people once had. The world of values, therefore, deprives us not just of the idea of the good, but imposes an actual sensual deprivation. Illich sees an example of this deprivation in the way contemporary people experience their own bodies. Until well into the 18th century, he says, the body was felt to be a microcosm. There was a correspondence between the individual body and nature as a whole. According to a tradition which descended from the Roman physician Galen, the body was thought to be composed of 4 humors, and health was conceived in terms of the balance of these cosmic elements, as they flowed or were blocked within the body. Illich has studied this humoral, microcosmic body by observing the way it conditioned the encounter between physicians and their patients. The doctor, in this old tradition, he says, could do no more than support and foster the body's tendency to return to a balanced state. Unlike the contemporary doctor, who determines his patient's experience by his diagnosis, these older doctors had to rely on the patient's own report.